Karen's smug grin could have curdled milk as she stood on her pristine lawn. Phone pressed to her ear, reporting her neighbor's disgraceful garden. By dusk, she'd learned that justice, like weeds, has a way of growing where you least expect it. In the quiet suburb of Willow Creek, where picket fences and manicured lawns were sacred, Karen Miller was the self-appointed queen of order. Her house gleamed, her roses were symmetrical, and her complaints were legendary. Across the street, Sarah Nguyen's garden was a wild masterpiece bursting with native wildflowers, herbs, and vegetables, a haven for bees and butterflies. To Karen, it was an eyesore, a rebellion against the neighborhood's unspoken code. To Sarah, it was her heart's work, a living tribute to her late mother, who taught her to nurture the earth. The trouble began on a humid June afternoon. Karen, armed with her HOA handbook, had spent weeks documenting Sarah's violations. Overgrown zinnias, unruly tomato vines, a compost bin that smelled like a landfill. Karen's list was meticulous. She'd emailed the HOA, posted passive-aggressive notes on the community board, and even rallied a few neighbors to her cause. But Sarah, a soft-spoken botanist in her late 20s, refused to conform. Her garden wasn't just plants. It was a sanctuary, a rebellion against sterile suburbia, and a promise to her mother's memory. Karen saw defiance. Sarah saw beauty. That morning, Karen's patience snapped. She'd spotted a single dandelion seed floating from Sarah's yard onto her own, a tiny invader in her perfect world. "Enough is enough," she muttered, grabbing her gardening gloves. Under the cover of dawn, while Sarah was at the farmer's market, Karen crept across the street. She didn't plan to destroy everything, just enough to make a point. She yanked out marigolds, snapped tomato stalks, and tore up a patch of lavender, tossing the plants into a pile. The chaos felt righteous. She dusted her hands, called the police, and reported Sarah's neglected garden as a public nuisance. "It's a health hazard," she lied, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Someone needs to intervene." By noon, Officer Daniel Carter arrived, a no-nonsense cop with a knack for spotting lies. Sarah returned home just as he knocked on her door, her arms full of seedlings for her next planting. The sight of her garden, her mother's legacy reduced to a battlefield, stopped her cold. Petals were crushed, roots exposed, and her carefully tended soil looked like a war zone. Her knees buckled, but rage kept her upright. "Who did this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Karen, watching from her porch, stepped forward, arms crossed. "It's about time someone cleaned up this mess," she said, her tone icy. "I called the police for the neighborhood's sake." Officer Carter's eyes narrowed. He'd dealt with Karens before, entitled types who weaponized complaints to control others. He walked the garden, noting the deliberate damage. Plants weren't wilted from neglect. They were violently uprooted. Sarah's hands shook as she pointed out the broken stems, her voice cracking as she explained each plant's purpose: milkweed for monarchs, basil for the community pantry, roses for her mother. Karen scoffed. "It's just weeds." But Carter wasn't buying it. He asked Karen to recount her morning, and her story unraveled. She claimed she'd only inspected the garden, but dirt on her gloves and a stray marigold petal on her shoe told a different tale. The confrontation escalated in Sarah's backyard. Neighbors gathered, drawn by the raised voices. Karen's composure cracked as Carter pressed her. "You expect me to believe this destruction just happened?" he asked, holding up a snapped sunflower stalk. Sarah's eyes burned with tears and fury. "You had no right," she shouted at Karen. "This was my mother's dream, not your personal vendetta." Karen doubled down, her voice shrill. "I'm protecting property values. You're the one breaking the rules." The air crackled with tension, each word a spark threatening to ignite. Neighbors whispered, some siding with Sarah's passion, others with Karen's obsession with order. Carter's investigation was swift but thorough. He found security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera, blurry but damning. Karen, in her pristine cardigan, ripping plants from the ground at 5 a.m. The crowd gasped as he played the clip on his tablet. Karen's face paled, her excuses crumbling. I was helping, she stammered, but the lie was laughable. Sarah's grief turned to cold resolve. You didn't just destroy my garden, she said, her voice low and cutting. You destroyed a piece of my family. The words hung heavy, silencing even Karen's staunchest allies. The police report was filed by sunset. Karen faced a $2,000 fine for property damage and a formal warning from the HOA she'd once wielded like a scepter. But the real punishment was social. Willow Creek's tight-knit community turned on her. Neighbors who'd once nodded at her complaints now avoided her gaze. Sarah's garden became a rallying point. Volunteers arrived the next day with seedlings and shovels, rebuilding what Karen had torn apart. Sarah, though heartbroken, found strength in the support. She planted a new rosebush, whispering her mother's name as she pressed the roots into the soil. Karen, meanwhile, retreated into her perfect house, her windows dark. The fine stung, but the isolation burned deeper. She'd wanted control, to impose her vision of perfection on a world that didn't need fixing. Instead, she'd exposed her own pettiness, her need to dominate masquerading as concern. Late at night, she stood at her window, watching Sarah's garden come back to life across the street. The wildflowers seemed to mock her, their colors brighter against her sterile lawn. For the first time, Karen wondered if she'd been wrong not just about the garden, but about what made a community whole. The story didn't end with tidy redemption. Karen never apologized, and Sarah never forgave. The neighborhood healed, but the scar remained a reminder that order without empathy is just destruction in disguise. Sarah's garden flourished, a living testament to resilience, while Karen's lawn, flawless as ever, felt like a prison of her own making. The community learned to value what grew from love, not control, but the cost was a wound that wouldn't fully mend. What do you think? Does Karen's punishment fit her crime, or does justice demand more than a fine? Share your thoughts on where the line between order and obsession lies in a community like this.